Hello everyone. Today I'm gonna do a small update on what the hell is going on in World of Warships. I did have a stream, but it ended up being so long. Basically, my stream ended up being like something like 40 minutes. So I'm just gonna do a bit more of a compressed version of what's going on and a bit of my opinions on all of this. First of all, well, the big elephant in the room is probably the fact that Wargaming announced Soviet cruisers. They announced a completely new sub-branch of Soviet cruisers, and it will start, well, actually it'll start at tier 5. What's happening is that the Kirov and Moskva are being moved into premiums, or they're being turned into premium ships. And the reason for this is apparently because, well, they didn't like the way the cruiser line worked. And honestly, I can kind of agree with this. The cruiser line is really wonky. You have a lot of light HE spammers, and then you have something like the Moskva at the tier 10, which is a complete opposite to everything the line has been so far. It's something I've actually mentioned several times. You spec IFHE, but then you need to unspec when you reach the Moskva, because you basically need to build full tank all of a sudden. So the reasons for them to rebuild the line, I can understand, but what is a bit questionable is the fact that they're actually, well, as you can see from the image, they are adding the Tallinn, the Riga, and the Petropavlovsk, which are completely new heavy cruisers to the line, which basically means they're adding a Soviet cruiser line split. And this is a bit ridiculous when you consider that, well, that means there's going to be 5 tier 10 Soviet cruisers in the game now. 5. There's going to be Nevsky, Petropavlovsk, Smolensk, Moskva, and Stalingrad. 5 of them. That's 5 tier 10 cruisers is as many as the IGN, the Royal Navy, and the Italian navies combined have. In fact, the Royal Navy doesn't even have 2 yet. They're about to have the Goliath, which will make that number into a combined 5. So those huge navies combined have as many tier 10 cruisers in the game as the Soviet cruisers. When you consider that out of all these navies, the Soviet Navy was by far the smallest. They were pitiful in size in comparison. They were like, what, a 10th of the size of the Royal Navy? Okay, don't quote me on numbers, but like the difference was night and day. So the fact that they have this many ships is just, well, it tells you who's the developer of the game. Let's put it like that. Moving on, this is the Kotovsky. This is the one that's going to replace the previous tier 5. As far as I understood, it's going to have, of course, smaller guns in return, because they want to make this a light cruiser line. Also, the Moskva will become a coal ship. And instead, they will have that new Alexander Nevsky cruiser replace it. I'm not sure actually how it's going to work, but as far as they told, the line is going to be 152 to 180 millimeter guns, which means IFHE, HE spammers. Hands up everyone who thought that this game needed another Smolensk at tier 10. Oh, no one's raising their hand? Well, that's curious. I thought everyone wanted more of these. Hands up everyone who wanted more Soviet ships. No one's raising their hands. That's strange. Anyway, I'm not very positive about this, because I've been looking forward to certain lines like Italian battleships for a long time, and I think it's kind of silly that we're getting more and more of these Soviet fantasy ships into the game when there are these historically huge navies that don't even have their first line, like the first battleship line added to the game, and we're getting like 5th tier 10 cruiser. It seems a bit like nonsense. Regardless, the sub-branch, the heavy cruiser line, which is the tier 8, is going to be the Tallinn. These are going to have, this one is going to have 180 millimeter guns, and the tier 9, the Riga and the Petropavlovsk, these are both going to have 220 millimeter guns. The main feature of these new cruisers is going to be, once again, they're going to have Soviet Stalinium shells, which means really effective armor piercing, very good ballistics, aka Stalinium, and a short arming threshold, which kind of scares me because it might be like Stalingrad's fantasy shells that basically never give you overpens. Wargaming states that these shells will be effective against both cruisers and battleships. These strengths are offset with an average reload time and a special accuracy settings. As range increases, shell dispersion grows faster than with other cruisers. So the idea is it's going to have like Kremlin, where ideally the dispersion is supposed to be worse at long range, but as we all know, the Kremlin dispersion at long range isn't actually that bad. In fact, Kremlin dispersion at long range is really, really good because it has such a low vertical dispersion, so it actually ends up being one of the most accurate battleships at range. We'll see if we're going to have something similar with some kind of hidden parameters making these Soviet cruisers also incredibly potent. They look very, very Soviet. I mean, the Petropavlovsk looks very much like, honestly, Vladivostok, a huge nose on it, and they look like the standard Soviet ships you would expect, but... And of course, one other thing that must be mentioned is they will of course have radar. So that means we have more radar ships, and especially 12 km radar ships into the game. They mentioned that they will announce detailed parameters, more of these later or shortly, but I don't know. I think there's so many balance issues, and I'm not sure why they felt like who besides the Russians really wanted more Soviet ships into the game. I honestly, this just feels like, uh-oh, we need to appease the player base on the Russian server, so we're just gonna add another line of fantasy ships into this. And I understand that they are limited on just what ships they can add and so forth, but did it really need to be yet another line of Soviet ships? I'm getting a bit tired of this, especially because they have proven that they are not very good or even willing to balance some of these ships. Smolensk has been a nightmare for a long time, Kremlin has been ridiculous, and they seem very, very resistant to actually balancing these ships out, and honestly they're just sitting back and let's let it ride and see what happens. Speaking of this though, in the patch 0.9.3, they're actually going to be moving Smolensk away from the armor. The statement they made is, well, the following ships will no longer be available in the armor. Soviet cruiser Smolensk, tier 10. Jean Bart, French, tier 9. Neustrashimy, Soviet, tier 9. Flint, tier 7, the cruiser. And of course, American destroyer Black, tier 9. All of those will be removed from the armor, which means you can no longer get them. Smolensk and Jean Bart are being removed because they state they have become very popular on their tiers. In order to maintain the diversity of team compositions at a proper level, these ships will be removed for an undefined time, but may return in the future. Well, obviously Smolensk, especially in ranked, for those that played it, it was basically 4 Smolensk per team. It was completely spammed for obvious reason. The ideal solution would have been balancing the ship, but Wargaming instead, well, they're removing it, and we'll probably see it in a crate or some sort. It will probably come back. We know it will come back. Due to different reasons, Neustrashimy, Flint and Black are not very demanded for steel now, and thus they won't be available for steel, but not earlier than in half a year they will return to the armory, where they will be obtainable in exchange for coal. So that means Neustrashimy, Flint and Black will become coal ships in about 6 months. I don't really have any too big of an issue with this. Honestly, I think that's how steel and coal should have worked from the beginning. It gives you a chance to play these ships first, and then later on they become available to everyone, instead of gating them behind this resource where you can't get them at all. So I actually kind of like this change. We understand that accumulating resources for ships is a long process, which is why we wanted to warn you in advance, so those interested can steer these ships into their ports before update 0.9.3 goes live in approximately 2 months. So 2 months from now. Additionally, we would like to give you heads up on the upcoming ship. French destroyer Marceau, the one that I featured on my channel, that will be a coal ship. Japanese battleship Yashima will be a steel ship. This is probably going to piss a lot of people off because, well, this is going to be the first time they go past the 460mm threshold and they gate that ship behind steel. That is not really that big of a fan. Japanese destroyer Hayate will be available for free XP. European destroyer Småland will be available for free XP. Of those two, I personally think the Småland is the better ship. I played a fair bit of Hayate back in the day, and it was kind of like a mix of Shimakaze and Harugumo, while also kind of being worse than both of them. Still though, that is some of the news I wanted to share with you guys, because honestly pretty important stuff. Oh, and another thing. I'm actually trying to grind my 100k followers on Twitch. We are 2,700 followers away from reaching 100,000, which means my huge giveaway is basically just around the corner. So that's pretty awesome. If you can take the time to drop me a follow on Twitch, I'll appreciate it. If not, if you can sub to me on YouTube, I'll appreciate it. Sell out, blah, blah, blah. I will talk to you guys later. Have a fantastic evening, my dudes.